There's you. Are you sure you want to do that?
I'll get you.
Yeah.
Cool. Alright, hi guys. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming to Hard Earth. So it looks like we will be going a little old school today. We're having some issues with the projector. So maybe we'll try to get an IT guy in here, or Shikara, and other, in any cases, just kind of run with it. And I'll also post the slides as we go along, just in case you want to follow on your laptop, whatever's easiest for you. Okay, so just bigger picture first, and then we'll hand it over to Shikara. So yeah, Hard Earth's in its third year. So it's part of Robley Living Lab. Some of you may have heard about. It's a dorm focused on sustainability. We have Lynn, head of RSLs in the back here. So Hard Earth itself is a class, and it's also a speaker series. So you can come to any of these talks that you want. You can come to one, you can come to all. You can, hopefully at this point you'll stay for at least one, but I'll have to, I suppose. And if you take it for credit, then you'll have the bonus of meeting with myself. I guess I should introduce myself as well. So I'm a second year PhD in management science and engineering. I'm focusing on climate and energy policy, specifically looking at modeling climate impacts. So impacts of climate change on how society functions, how the economy functions. I'm a second year, so you can't push me too much further than that right now. But hopefully by the end of the year, we'll figure it out. So this year, this fall rather, Hard Earth is focusing on the geopolitics of sustainability. So a broader theme for the year will be challenges associated with globalization, and then each quarter will have a specific theme that we hit on. Each quarter we'll have 4 graduate students, Shikara being our first, and at the end we'll have a capstone speaker. And I think I got halfway through my sentence before, but in between the speakers we'll have a week of discussion. If you're not signed up for the course, you're still welcome to come. If you are signed up for the course, we strongly encourage you to come. We don't make too many demands on you, but attending both the talk and the discussion in the intervening weeks, which will also take place in here, is sort of the baseline. And then we found that past students like to have some sort of deliverable, so we might just ask everybody does or collaborates on one blog post that sort of summarizes the talks in those intervening weeks. So we have 4 talks. They'll be every 2 weeks. So we have Shikara as our first one. Then we have another student from School of Earth as our second, focusing on role of for-profit companies. Then we jump over to anthropology, and we're looking at how climate influences politics and various issues at the U.S.-Mexico border. And then our last student talk, will be with somebody from history who's looking at the history of climate denial from the perspective of the for-profit companies. So just a bit about our speaker for today then. So Shikara is entering his 5th year? 5th, 4th, because you have your own. Okay. Yeah. So I'll defer to Shikara on that one. Shikara is a Stanford Earth PhD student, and as you guys may have seen on the posters around, we'll be focusing, the title of this talk will be Climate Policy and Inequality. So considering the distribution of costs in designing carbon pricing policies. So we'll give him 25 minutes and then we'll open it up. And I'll make sure to post the slides right now in case you want to follow along as he's going. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Great. Thanks. There would have been a slide that says climate policy and inequality, considering the distribution of costs in designing carbon pricing policies. So today I'm talking about how climate policy might interact with economic inequality. And in particular, I'll be talking about what economists call distributional impact. I guess as a disclaimer, I will be, for those of you with economics backgrounds, I might be explaining things that are kind of obvious to you. I apologize. This is, inherently interdisciplinary, so I have to cover many bases. So what are distributional impacts? Distributional impacts are how the costs and benefits of a particular policy, whether it's actually in reality or being proposed, might be distributed across a population in question or the economy. So you might be interested in thinking about, like I am, how the costs and benefits are distributed across different income groups. But you can also look at things like how the costs and benefits of a policy are distributed across different regions within the US or across the world. Or you could be looking at how a particular policy might affect different demographic groups. So you might be interested in whether young people are more affected by a particular policy, or whether women might be more disadvantaged by a particular policy, or whether communities of color are more disadvantaged by a particular policy. So distributional impacts talks about that broadly. Because I am using economic tools, and because I am taking kind of a first pass at this methodology that I'm developing, my research focuses on the economic inequality component of distributional impacts. And I'm using the PowerPoint for me to start if I'm walking over for something that you guys can't see. And when talking about distributional impacts, you often talk about a progressive policy versus a regressive policy. So a progressive policy is one, or starting with regressive. A regressive policy is one that lower income households bear a larger burden of the policy. So, or if rich households stands to gain more from the policy than the poor households. And conversely, progressive is the other way around. Might be obvious to some of you, but worth clarifying. And finally, my talk focuses on carbon mitigation policy. So I'm looking specifically at carbon pricing. Obviously, there are other climate policies that might touch upon or interact with economic inequality, but that's the area that I'm focusing on. So to give a bit of background and motivation, kind of, first of all, personal background, who is this person talking to, and like why is he interested in this topic. So after finishing my undergraduate in economics and environmental science, I worked for the chief economist at the Environmental Defense Fund before starting my master's in public policy, which was immediately before coming here. And so my background is one of an economist. And at the end of my third year, or no, at the end of my third year, yeah. At the end of my third year, in 2016, I took 6 months off my PhD program to go work at the Council on Environmental Quality under the Obama White House. And that was, in 2016, pretty big things happened in US politics. So it was a very interesting time to be there, for sure. But one thing that I started thinking about, kind of seeing the election results come in and kind of processing the election results after the fact, is how there were certain states that the Democrats had taken as kind of given that they would vote Democrat just historically because they had. So that got me thinking, maybe we need to step back and kind of reassess how different policies affect different people and why people might be voting for, why people might have changed their political ideology or affiliation. And particularly with regards to my research, I was interested in how, in looking at that for climate policy and thinking about how maybe this is an opportunity to rethink how we can design different climate policies to address different ethical or political objectives that we might have. So for me, like the ethical objective is making sure that if we have a climate policy, it doesn't disproportionately hurt low-income populations. But you might also be interested in that from a political perspective, right? Analyzing, okay, who stands to gain and lose from this, and how does that benefit or harm the ability for us to pass this legislation or this regulation. So for the rest of the talk, I'll be giving kind of an overview of conceptually how climate policy might interact with economic inequality. And then move on to existing approaches that researchers have taken to address, to look at this question. And then I'll go a bit into kind of work that I've been doing in the past 4 years. So looking at findings from a multi-model study that I had the opportunity to be a co-author on, and then diving into my dissertation work, which is looking at better representing labor and how the impacts of climate policy on jobs might interact with this economic inequality question. So looking at how climate policy might interact with inequality broadly. So first, looking at the benefits of climate policy, how might that interact with economic inequality, and how could the benefits differ by income group? So kind of worth clarifying that the benefits of a climate policy are a reduction in the cost of climate change. And that's worth mentioning because I talk about the costs of climate policy. So bear in mind that when I talk about costs, it's the cost of policy, not the cost of climate change itself. But so the benefits of a climate policy are just reduction in climate change. So that comes with the standard suspects for what might happen in a warmer world. So you're looking at increases in average temperatures, extreme weather events, reduced agriculture output, impacts on ecosystems, and the list goes on and is constantly expanding as researchers find new ways in which climate change can affect the economy. How these interact with economic inequality is that lower income populations are more vulnerable to these effects. So if you have more extreme temperature days, then a rich person sitting in their mansion in Houston or wherever it might get warm can handle the heat by just turning up their AC, whereas someone in a low income community might not have the capacity to tolerate such changes in their environment. And that's within a country. And then looking across countries, you have that lower income countries tend to be clustered around the tropics. So in that climate change affects the effects of climate change are felt most in the tropics. You get that lower income countries tend to face more of the brunt of climate change as well. So overall, thinking back again at whether a policy is progressive or regressive, looking solely at the benefits of climate policy, you would think that addressing this and reducing climate change, reducing how much these communities feel the impacts of climate change, would be a progressive policy. But then we move on to the costs of climate policy. So how might the costs borne by different income groups differ? And then for that, economists have identified two channels through which that effect might take hold, and I have a pretty diagram that is unfortunately not up there, but maybe you have the slides at this point. So you have, on one hand, what's called the use side effect. So that's how climate policy might interact with your consumption. So this is the idea that in any energy system with any amount of fossil fuels in it, if you impose a carbon tax, then at least on the short run, electricity prices go up or energy prices go up. And in that, lower income households tend to spend more of their, as a percentage, more of their income on energy. They feel more of the brunt of the climate policy than does a rich household who might, in absolute terms, use more energy, but they have so much discretionary income that as a percentage is not very much. So looking at that side, you might think, okay, climate policy might be regressive on its own, on the cost side. And then the other channel, so we have the use side. So the other channel is the sources side, which is how climate policy might affect your income. So this is the idea that that people against climate policy might bring up. Okay, climate policy might affect jobs, right? Like jobs in the fossil fuel sector will either disappear or their wages will go down. And analyses, or there's the wages side, sorry. And then there's also impacts on capital. So economists think about output in a particular industry being created by labor and capital. Capital being, capital, in short, being how, like a capital-intensive industry, most of their profits go to shareholders rather than the workers, basically, is a good way to think about it. So in that, energy-intensive industries tend to be capital-intensive. The sources side tends to be progressive in that a carbon tax might hurt higher income households more because a larger proportion of their income is in capital, so in stocks or participation in the stock market. So what are some approaches that people have used to analyze this and how all these pieces fit together? Sorry, how those two channels fit together. So we're now looking at the cost side. And I guess it's worth clarifying that I am interested in focusing on the cost side for two reasons. One, because the cost of climate policy tends to be brought up by opponents of climate policy as a reason why we shouldn't do it, but their claims always tend to be kind of nebulous and not really grounded in data. So what if we could put an actual number on it to be able to show, okay, well, that those numbers aren't actually nearly as big as the benefits from climate change, right? So it's useful to kind of dispel the bogeyman that they're bringing up. But I also think that for lower income households, and because my research interests are looking at lower income households, lower income households tend to be credit constrained, so they have more difficulty borrowing to spend more now, or spend more now, etc. What this means is that even if there's a short-term cost to implementing climate policy that yields a massive benefit later on, they might not be able to put up the upfront cost right now. They might feel the impacts of a price hike in electricity, and they might be that impact on their livelihood might be important enough such that they might not such that might be more immediately important than like the benefits of reduced climate change in the future. So that is why I'm focusing on costs. So going back to the approaches that researchers use in assessing how the costs of climate policy might be distributed across different income groups. A commonly used technique, and this dates back from the 70s actually, where they were assessing the initial iteration of the Clean Air Act to kind of a gasoline tax, and now more recently looking at a carbon tax, are these input-output models, and these use what are known as input-output tables, where on the slide, if you have it in front of you, you have every kind of industry in rows, and then the columns also have industries, and it shows how much of the output from one, or it shows the flows between industries. So it would show how much of the coal produced by the coal sector goes into the electric power sector, and then how much of electricity generated from the electric power sector goes on to create the shirt that I'm wearing or whatever. So that allows you to, if you know the carbon content of a particular fuel, to trace, upon imposing a carbon tax, to trace how that carbon tax would kind of flow throughout the economy, and by what amount different goods will change in prices. And if you have that and you combine it with data on different income groups and how much of what good they consume, you can get a sense of how much they'll be affected on the use side. So how much their consumption will be affected by a carbon tax. Again, the literature in this area has shown that because lower income households tend to spend a larger percentage of their income on energy, carbon pricing is regressive unless you use the income that you gain from a carbon tax to do other things to compensate them. And I'll return to that idea in a moment. And then, so one thing that leaves out, however, right, is the ability for firms to respond to the fact that energy is more expensive now by changing the way they produce things and by by adjusting their production processes to rely more on other inputs. And one more sophisticated way of looking at it is through the use of a particular kind of simulation model called the computable general equilibrium model. And you can think of these as kind of, the weather models underlying the weather forecast that you check in the morning, right? Those are kind of, those are relying on equations of atmospheric physics that people understand, and that's used to kind of figure out predict what will happen in the future for the weather in Palo Alto right now. So in a similar way, we can use the understanding of economics to predict what might happen in the economy if you turn a little knob. So in our case, our knob is increasing the carbon tax a bit. What happens to the economy? So that includes equations on how firms might adjust their production processes to a response in energy prices, and how that might affect the price of goods, and how that might affect how many workers they need to hire, and how that might affect people's wages, as well as how that might affect people's how much of what people want to consume. And because that's a huge set of equations, you use these computer simulation models to predict how that might play out. And these differ in terms of focus. These differ in terms of focus. So you might have a standard CG model might represent all households, all consumers as one household, so they aggregate all the US or whatever you're looking at to one person to see on average how that affects consumers. But if you're looking at economic inequality, you might be interested in increasing the number of households you have in your model by creating buckets for the population and bucketing people into different income groups. Or you might be really interested in looking at how the electricity sector might respond in particular. So you might have a model that has a super detailed electricity sector with a very simple economic model that's linked together. And then some models just look at the country as a whole. Some models look at particular regions. So these models really differ in how they're designed. So that brings me to this multi-model comparison exercise that I was fortunate enough to be part of. And that's part of an initiative run out of Stanford called the Energy Modeling Forum. And it's a EMF for short. And it's a model intercomparison exercise where modeling teams from around the world get together, and they have a particular research question in mind. So then they'll just agree upon what same scenarios to run across all of the models, and see where the models, these really different models, where they agree and where they disagree, to see what overall kind of what overall conclusions we can draw from the aggregate of these models, as well as where they disagree, to try to figure out, okay, why are they disagreeing, and where are the areas that we might be uncertain about the effects of a particular policy. So one of the more recent ones was the one I participated in, which was EMF 32, which was looking specifically at US greenhouse gas reduction policies. And one of the papers that came out of that was one on distributional impact. And the reference, if you're interested in it, the first author is Caron, C-A-R-O-N. It was in Climate Change Economics 2018. And that looks at distributional impacts using, for the models that participated, that had enough disaggregation in consumers to be able to look at how a climate policy might affect different income groups. So the scenarios that we ran differed in the carbon price path, so how aggressive you were in your carbon policy. And there's a table in your slides if you can eventually get them. And in that table, the rows are the different carbon price paths, and the columns are different assumptions on what you do with the income that you generate, what the government does with the income that they generate from the carbon tax. So the three basic ones that tend to be looked at a lot in the literature are A, dividing up the money equally and giving it back to households on either on a per capita, usually on a per capita basis. Right, on a per capita basis. B, looking at reducing capital taxes, and then C, reducing labor taxes. So capital taxes are the taxes that the most relevant example for capital taxes for normal people, for people as with corporations, is looking at the taxes on the money that you earn on the stock market. And a tax on labor is personal income tax, or payroll tax. So those are the more kind of vanilla revenue reuse scenarios that we ran. But we also looked at scenarios in which you use the money to protect the lowest income households while using the rest of the money for combinations of the previous three that I just mentioned. So, and that was to get a sense of, okay, if we really cared about protecting low-income households, how much would that actually cost the economy as a whole? And this is the part where, if you have the slides, it's very useful. I have this slide has a graph on how much welfare changes in a world with a carbon tax compared to a world without a carbon tax for five income quintiles, one being the poorest income household and 5 being the richest. And what you see is that lump sum rebates to households is the most progressive because the basic idea is that if you give $1,000 to the poorest person in the U.S. and you give $1,000 to Jeff Bezos does not care, right? $1,000 does not mean anything to him. $1,000 to the poorest person in the U.S. probably means a lot to them because it's a lot bigger, percentage increase in their income. And then capital and labor taxes, although they have the least impact on GDP overall, they tend to be regressive, or in some models slightly progressive, but a lot less progressive than just giving the money back to the population. And then on the other 3 or 4 scenarios where we're protecting low-income populations, what we found is that the amount of the percentage of your revenue you have to use to protect the lowest income household is actually quite small, even in the most pessimistic model scenario. You only used 25% of the revenue that you raised. In most of them, it was anywhere from 5 to 10%. So that means that you can protect your low-income households, and then use the rest of the money to give it back to reduce taxes or whatever to both get your get the cost on GDP quite low, as well as protecting your low-income households. So that kind of gets you the best of both worlds. So that's kind of reassuring in that, if you have a climate policy but you're not doing anything with the tax revenue, then that might be regressive, but our studies showed that it's quite easy to make a policy progressive. But there are a few things that I noticed in participating in this research study that were lacking in the models because these were like the leading models in the field. So it was surprising to me that labor was not terribly well represented in these models. A few assumptions in the models included that workers are uniform. So the labor provided by, or if the richest person in the US provides 1 hour of work and the poorest person provides 1 hour of work, like that's equally valuable to the company and they get in return the same wage, which is obviously not what happens in reality. And that mobility is costless and instantaneous, so if a coal worker loses their job in the coal mines, they can just pick up their bags and take a job anywhere else depending on where the wage is the highest. And what that leads to is workers moving from places where the wages went down to a client policy to other industries, and wages kind of instantly equilibrate across industries. So that's a bit problematic if you're interested in looking at this this distribution question with regards to labor. So in my dissertation work, I'm combining a traditional CGE model with an economic model where, using individual data, I predict what choices people, what sectors people choose to work in, and then running the CG model with the carbon price, I get the change in wages, and then that's fed into my sectoral choice model, which then predicts different sectors that people work in. And why it's useful to use individual data is that I'm able to look at things like education and how much experience people have in particular sectors. And some preliminary results that I get are that people obviously have a very hard time moving across industries. So a worker who has 20 years of experience in the coal sector would get a much lower income if they walk into the door at another industry because their experience isn't quite transferable. And that people have, workers have preferences as to where they work. So even if the wage is a lot higher in another industry, a lot of people don't move. And that could be due to geographic preferences as well as other preferences about their work, or about the sector that they work in. So the anticipated findings from that or the observation that I have is that in the more emissions intense industries, there are higher earning jobs for lower educated people. So lower educated people can get a higher wage working in emissions intense industries. So if you hit those industries harder, then you might end up in the labor aspect having a slightly regressive policy. So I am still working on my dissertation, but one thing that I'm interested in looking at is policies where you run similar scenarios to the one that I was talking about in EMF, but where you are using that revenue to fund retraining programs to make it easier for a worker to move across industries. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what I'm working on, and I hope that's the beginning of that can start an interesting conversation.
Cool. All right. Well, we have about 10 minutes of Q&A. We also have a marker in case you want to diagram anything out. But yeah, we'll open up the questions for if anybody has them.
I didn't quite understand the project that you
EMF, yeah. So EMF is basically a group of researchers from research teams from around the world, and they all have their pet models, right? Like MIT has a model that they developed that's developed for modeling climate change, and there's one based out of there are a few that the U.S. government uses, for instance, and they all differ in how the models are structured based on the beliefs of the modelers as well as what project that model was initially built for. So they differ in how in various dimensions, but how granular they're looking at the electricity sector, like how many households they have, like how many regions they have. So in the particular iteration of the EMF that I was working on, we were looking at how the US economy might respond to a carbon tax. So then we give it the exact same, we give each of the models the exact same scenarios to run, with the idea that because the assumptions underlying the models are different, you might end up having differences between the models, even though in all of them you're saying, you know, implement a $25 carbon tax increasing at 5% a year or whatever. And kind of the value add of that sort of analysis is figuring out kind of what the consensus conclusions are from the, you know, the cutting edge climate policy modelers or energy modelers throughout the world. But also looking at, okay, where we disagree and what methodologically is leading to these kind of differences in what the models predict. That should be the question.
Yeah.
So thanks for the talk, and I actually learned quite a bit I didn't know about carbon taxes, so thank you for that. One thing, you know, I've heard a lot about carbon taxes and other climate policy in the past. It's like it's a very complex, as you've outlined, it's a very complex issue with figuring how the policy would affect low-income households as opposed to higher-income households, and because of that, there's often a lot of opposition. You know, you make arguments that it'll affect almost any climate policy can affect low-income households. So even, you know, if your research does, or I know it has, and if it continues to effectively find ways to, you know, come up with progressive policies, how would you like communicate that in a way that wouldn't be, you know, perceived as it being a regressive policy?
Communicate that to kind of policymakers or to the general public?
A bit of both.
I mean, one good thing about the Energy Modeling Forum is that it's the U.S. government realizes that it's there. So, like, you know, when we release the report, there's a session that we have on the Hill where we like present our findings to congressmen. So that's good. Yeah, I think the general. I mean, obviously, in this current political environment, they're not really talking about climate policies. But I think where people talk about distribution, people tend to think about the regressive impact. I think it's just a matter of no, actually, I'll take that back. There were in 2010 when Congress was debating cap and trade policies, there were a few alternatives that were proposed that were explicitly kind of addressing this question. They called it cap and dividend was what they called the rebate to households. So people tend to be aware of that you could use the revenue in certain ways to reduce reduce the impacts on lower income households. And if this research progresses further, this provides new options for future legislation that they could use the revenue in different ways to achieve different goals that they might have. Yeah.
When you speak with legislators, do you find them engaged and competent? Do they understand that? Are they interested?
So I actually missed out on the briefings. I did not participate in briefings. I won't talk from personal experience. But having worked in the government, I know that the elected officials that you see on the news and whatever, they have opinions, but they have large, they all have a huge staff behind them, and I think representative officials who are interested in the topic, representative officials or elected officials hire staff depending on their priorities. So if a congressperson or whatever or a president is interested in a climate policy, then they tend to just hire people who have expertise in the area. So the people that are interested are competent, but the people who aren't, don't have the staff that, you know what I mean? If you don't care about a topic, you're not going to hire an expert in that topic. So I think as long as you're kind of a core number of elected officials who have competent and well-informed staff, and those people can write, draft, and sponsor bills, and those bills get enough traction, then that's it's not necessarily a bad thing that it is a small minority of people who have, you know, IAM policy experts on their staff. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. So it seems like a lot of your research is really relevant to environmental justice movements. So I'm curious if you've done any collaborations with community organizers or policy advocates about environmental justice issues, or how you think they might benefit from the data?
Yeah. So I haven't, during my PhD, I haven't interacted with you know, EJ communities, partially because before I engage with the outside world, I want to have like concrete results to show them, you know. And the EMF stuff they kind of did the outreach for, so that was their thing. But I guess in a past life, like during college, I interned for a year for an EJ organization in West Harlem. So I have like a bit of an EJ background, I think. One thing, once the methodology is up running, then you can apply it to look at how the costs and benefits might cut across, you know, communities of color, or in addition to lower income groups. And I think, so eventually I think it could be a useful, you know, project and approach for EJ communities, but so far my research is not there.
Great talk. I was just curious if in your research you've thought or considered like the idea of scaling this sort of look to sort of an international community, and thinking about whether or not it would be applicable to like maybe the globe.
Yeah, so one big problem with looking at, so my work kind of focuses a lot on using, or depends a lot on good data on employment and how much experience individual people have in your data set in different industries. And unfortunately, and one of the reasons why I ended up kind of just focusing on the US is, A, because I have the most experience with the US, but also because data is the most available in the US. So there are a lot of smart people at Stanford, you know, working in the developing context and who know how to get around kind of, you know, imperfect data issues, but I'm not yeah, there are a few countries, Brazil and Indonesia, I think, have a lot of high quality data. So there are some studies that are kind of looking at micro data and looking at how climate policies might cut across different groups within those countries. But I think to get kind of to get a global scale, you would have to still rely on very aggregate data. So there's a bit of like a feasibility question.
There's time for last question.
Oh.
One last question.
Oh.
Yeah, I just was curious to how the Paris Agreement, how that, how the agreement itself, the policies presented would affect specifically lower income families in the United States, and how the Trump administration's response and the subsequent, you know, the individual states who vowed to follow it, how that kind of played out.
Yeah, I mean, so how that played into it, I think that I don't think like low income populations were kind of a focus when they were setting their targets, right? In general, so the reason why I was brought into the White House was because they were releasing a report as part of the UNFCCC process act that where the Paris Agreement, where under the Paris Agreement, each country agreed to submit a long-term proposal on how they would achieve their emissions targets. And for the U.S., it was definitely okay. President Obama has stated these targets in the past. So let's look at these targets and then run all of our most powerful models to see like how we can get there by like 85% reduction by 2030. So it's definitely more of a target first, and then let's see how we can get there approach. So because it's target first and then implementation later, you could go about achieving your emissions reductions targets in whatever way you want. So I think, the effects of the Paris Accord on distributional impacts or whatever are no different from a carbon tax on those same outcomes. And the effect of the Trump administration is because they're not doing anything, there's no. Yeah.
Cool. Well, one more hand for Shakara. Sweet. And I think we can both stick around for a little bit if you guys have questions. Otherwise, hope to see you next week for discussion. Or filling that in 2 weeks for the next talk by Hajin. It's going to be on the role of corporations in sort of addressing some of these questions Shakara was talking about. So thanks, guys.
So I just rolled in the past.
Yeah.
So I was clearly a bit late.
Yeah, no worries about that.
Sorry about that.
That is...
What's the normal timing of the class?